Bonsoir à toutes et tous. J'ai d'abord, avant toute chose, envie de vous partager le bonheur que j'ai et le plaisir de retrouver enfin le public des grandes conférences namuroises après 1 an et demi de pause forcée. Donc c'est une nouvelle saison qui s'ouvre à nous, ici, et que nous avons en plus le plaisir d'inaugurer avec notre nouvelle docteure honoris causa, Carola Rackete. Carola, Anne-Sophie. Dear Carola, we are very glad to host you today face-to-face in real life. We had the chance to meet you and discuss with you at the beginning of this year when we were organizing the Doctor Honoris Causa ceremony. You received the grade of DHC of the University of Namur on the 6th of May, together with 3 other personalities, Ilham Kadri, Gaël Giraud and Sebastião Salgado. At the time, do you remember? You promised to visit us for a conference, and this day is today. Thank you very much for your coming in Namur. Jeroen Darken, the Vice-Rector to International Relations, has the floor to introduce you to our audience this evening. Thank you to Anne-Sophie Brandonks for leading this meeting. It will be possible to ask questions at the end of the conference in French if you want. Carola understands well French. Enjoy the evening and see you again afterwards. Jeroen.
Oui, mesdames et messieurs, bienvenue donc de ma part et aussi de la part de notre rectrice Annick Castio qui ne peut malheureusement pas être présente à cette première grande conférence namuroise de l'année 2021-2022, de l'année académique 2021-2022. Comme la langue maternelle donc de Madame Rackete est l'allemand, je me permets d'adresser quelques petits mots en allemand à notre invitée. Mais ne vous inquiétez pas, donc je vais continuer en anglais. Donc, liebe Frau Rackete, liebe Carola, es freut uns sehr, dass wir heute die Möglichkeit haben, Sie als Dr. HC der Universität Namur heute in diesem Hörsaal begrüßen zu dürfen. So, why is it such a pleasure to be able to welcome you in this lecture hall in particular? Well, as you might have noticed, this lecture hall has a name. It is named after a Spanish, or more precisely a Basque Jesuit priest, Pedro Arrupe, who spent a part of his young life as a doctoral student in Japan. In fact, he was living in the suburbs of Hiroshima when the Enola Gay, an American B-29, dropped an atomic bomb on the city in August 1945. And although Arrupe had been imprisoned by the Japanese authorities before, he took the initiative to turn the Jesuit headquarters in Hiroshima into a hospital and use his medical knowledge to take care of the injured. So he demonstrated civil courage and clearly responded to the moral imperative that one should save lives whenever one sees a possibility to do so. Now, precisely this moral call was later pronounced by the German Nobel Prize winner Heinrich Böll to support the crew members of the vessel Cape Anamur when they set out to rescue Vietnamese boat people in the 1970s. And after reading your book, well, the German version of your book, I think it is safe to say that this call also inspired you as a captain of the Sea-Watch 3 back in 2019. I read your book with a lot of interest already a while ago. It's a book in which you intertwine the narrative of the rescue action on the coast of Lampedusa with aspects of your own life as a youngster, a student, a researcher, and a captain. It contains quotes of people who inspired and who continue to inspire you, and it also confronts the reader with your opinion on the kind of actions that are desperately needed if we want to save our planet. Now, I'm not going to summarize the book or read parts of it. I think it's a lot more authentic to let you do the talking. But to conclude my introduction, I would, however, just like to share 2 observations with you and the audience, one of which is subjective and based on the associations that one tends to make on the basis of things one happens to know by accident or out of interest. So first of all, I couldn't help to notice certain parallels, and perhaps I'm exaggerating a bit from your point of view, so some parallels between the life of Alexander von Humboldt, the German scientist and adventurer, and your life. So much like Humboldt in the 18th, 19th century, you like to travel the globe, you're interested in studying species and plants. However, also much like Humboldt, you want to be more than just an observer and an analyst, you also want to have a certain influence on the climate agenda. And people might not know this, but Humboldt helped to put climate issues on the political agenda in the United States back in the 19th century, and also had an influence on quite a lot of intellectuals, including Henry David Thoreau, who wrote a famous essay on civil disobedience, a notion that plays an important role in your book, but also in your life. Humboldt can also be considered as one of the persons who, because of his many parallel interests, encouraged others to approach phenomena or scientific topics from several mutually enriching angles. And this brings me to my second and final point. In contemporary society, as a complex system, as a truly complex system, the interrelated political, economic, ecological, humanitarian challenges, crises, catastrophes that we are confronted with call for blue sky and other inter-trans multidisciplinary approaches that allow us to adapt, readjust, or even totally rethink or reset the frameworks within which we consciously or unconsciously operate. And that is something that you also emphasize in your book, and that I'm sure you will share in more detail with the audience this evening. So, dear Carola, it is now time to give you the opportunity to share your much-needed constructive critical ideas with the audience, and I therefore invite you to take the floor, and I would also like to thank you on behalf of the University of Namur for being here.
I am the one who works at the radio. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Carola. Bonsoir, tout le monde. So you heard, like me, that the good news of tonight is that Carola understands French, but we're going to try to do that in English, of course, for you. So thank you so much for being with us tonight, Carola. And if we are here tonight, it's because we know you and we wanted to meet you. All of us know who you are, but I think that we just know a little part of who you are. I mean, you became world famous 2 years ago in 2019 when you were the captain of the Sea-Watch 3, the rescue boat, the Sea-Watch 3. But first of all, above all, I want to say, you are an ecologist, you are a climate activist for a long time. And if I asked you tonight to present yourself in a few words, what would you say, Carola? Who do you want us to meet tonight?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation and for the introduction. To get to the point and answer your question, I usually introduce myself as an ecologist and a social justice activist, because social justice to me includes, for example, the issue of migration and anti-racism, but I also see the environmental crisis as rooted in social injustice, and that's why I always include both these topics in my activism.
That's why you don't really like to speak about migration.
Well,
not only.
I think the issue of migration is very critical. But I don't see myself necessarily as the person who should speak about it. I think we should be critical who we are putting on the forefront of this issue and who we are listening to. In 2019, I got world famous, even though the people who were actually concerned were the people that we had lent a hand to during the rescue, but none of these 53 people is known by their names. None did get all these opportunities which I got. And I think when we speak about migration, we should put the people on the center stage who are the experts of these issues, who have their own experiences. And
in your opinion, you're not an expert?
Typically white activists.
Okay.
So that's why whenever I get invitations to speak about migration, I pass them on to some friends that I have who are very keen to share their experiences and who can do so much better than I can.
Okay. So right now you are 32, that's right?
Yeah, 33.
33, okay. We can say 32 if you prefer. And I know that you live in a ZAD. So a ZAD is une zone à défendre. I don't know if it's okay with my pronunciation, in Garzweiler, that's it? Okay, so it's not far from Cologne, so in the west of Germany, and not far from Belgium too. Garzweiler, it's a mine, a coal mine. Can you tell more about it? What's going on there?
Yeah, so as probably some of the people in the audience know, Germany is an absolute expert at greenwashing. You know, we always pretend to be doing really fantastic human rights, energy transition. You know, our politicians are really great at telling you the story, how much they're doing, while really they're not doing that much. So the same is true for the coal transition. We are ending coal in Germany only in 2038. Interestingly,
that's in the agreement, the federal agreement.
Yeah, that's a federal agreement. And we know, of course, that due to the urgency of the climate crisis, we would have to get out of coal much quicker. Actually, there is a study which says that if Germany wanted to keep this 1.5 degree target, we must not dig up the coal, which is now next to that place, Garzweiler. So for this reason, there is a ZAD in a village next to the coal pit. That village has the wonderful German name Lützerath, and that's where the climate activists are. There's one last farmer who doesn't want to sell his land. By the German mining law, you can get expropriated. So the government can just decide to take your land and to take your house if there is like resources of public interest under your land. And that is true until today. But of course, the argument is that there is no more public interest in digging up the carbon and burning it because we are already facing very severe consequences of the climate crisis. So on one hand, there is still like a legal procedure and the farmer resisting the expropriation. On the other hand, he invited the climate justice activists to be on his land. And we are in the process, and we have already built tree houses on the trees. We are having a camp on his land, a community kitchen, like a sort of autonomous zone where we are organizing and where we are planning to resist this expropriation.
I read that Garzweiler is the biggest site of greenhouse gases emitter in Europe. Is that right?
Yes, this is totally right, and it is vast. Like this area of Germany has most of the open lignite coal pits, but also, if we're looking at companies, 7 of the 10 biggest polluters are in Germany. They're German coal power stations. That's how bad the issue is on a European scale.
And do the media talk in Germany about it, about this ZAD? Or yes, because of the elections, or not at all? I don't know. Or more and more because of the elections?
The media is starting to talk about it.
Okay.
Also because something interesting happened about 2 weeks ago. Maybe because you're here in Belgium, of course, very close to Germany and to the west of Germany, you have heard of a place that is called Hambacher Forest. That was a forest next to another coal pit, which was occupied by tree houses. And the government decided to evict the tree houses and wanted to cut the trees to extend the coal pit. And during the eviction, after about 6 weeks, a court decided that the forest should be saved. But just 2 weeks ago, there was another court verdict which said the eviction was actually illegal. Like the forest should never have been evicted in the first place. So this is drawing new attention to the debate about coal. But also, of course, we have the elections coming on the next Sunday, and everyone is waiting for the result. And climate has been a hot issue of the discussion, but the question is, will the new government coalition really act or not? And whether they will act or not will be very visible on the issue of the coal pits. That's like the first thing they would need to do if they are serious on acting on the climate crisis.
And is there any support in the German population? Do you feel it?
There's generally a really high interest in the German population. I think similar to Belgium, a high understanding of the necessity to act on ecological issues, and probably more debate on the question how. Because often we are talking about the costs, and we're not looking at this from a perspective of social justice. Often we're taught about how much it would cost to act, and we're not told so much how not acting would cost us, and how the costs are going to be distributed. That is, of course, a core issue anytime we're debating the issue. But generally, the public, and particularly after the floodings that we had in Western Germany and also here in Belgium, of course,
we're going to speak about that a little later.
Really understands that we have to take these actions and is very supportive.
And how long do you think to stay there? Do you expect to last?
Well, at the moment, the farmer has been notified that he should leave his house, the house of his parents, like the parents' farm, on the 1st of November. So then we will probably have quite a big confrontation with the police. Last year we had a confrontation with the police about another forest which was going on for 10 weeks. Which was a very prolonged civil disobedience action with some autonomous activists, but also local citizen initiatives, many NGOs, and a broad spectrum of people coming together and groups coming together to push for the transition of the society.
And so tomorrow you go back in the Z?
Yes, tomorrow I will be going back to the ZAD, and we will be very happy to actually receive a visit from the Zapatistas, an indigenous community which has an autonomous territory in Mexico. And I'm sure they will also visit to Belgium. So you should probably watch out if you're interested to meet the Zapatistas. They are probably coming in the next weeks to Belgium as well.
Okay. And I have the impression when I heard you that it's like when you were the captain of the Sea-Watch 3, you opt for civil disobedience. In your opinion, Carola, is this the only means of action for activists like you today? To be heard, to be seen?
There are lots and lots of things which we should do, but I mean, given the context that I'm a white person with a European passport who has a lot of privileges, I should definitely use those privileges and use them to the best degree that I can. And that certainly includes using civil disobedience when it makes sense. And at the moment, the lives of people, particularly on the global south, are on the line because of the climate crisis. And similar to the situation on the ship, I have the possibilities and the privilege to do something, so I also have the responsibility to do something. And giving this very, very unequal and unjust situation that we are having globally on the world, the possibilities that I have as an activist here in the global north, which is also protected by the constitution, by certain laws, and it's relatively safe to engage in activism. All of that gives me the responsibility to act. And, of course, combined with the fact that most of the multinational companies which are acting and destroying the social but also ecological basis for life on this planet, they are headquartered here in the global north. So a combination of factors really, which gives us the responsibility to get engaged and also use civil disobedience.
So we understand that environment is a real subject, an important issue in the election campaign, because yes, we spoke about it. Next weekend there are elections in your country, in Germany, federal elections. You're going to choose the successor of Angela Merkel. What are, in your opinion, Carola, her results in environment issues? She did the job?
Well, maybe to explain that Angela Merkel, before she became chancellor, she actually was environmental minister.
Yeah.
Probably some 20 plus years ago. So she also is a scientist. She's got a PhD in physics. So she knows, she understands what is going on, and still she hasn't been acting as much as we would hope to. So at this point...
She recently said that it was not enough.
Exactly. She has said a lot of times that it is not enough, and she often refers to the fact that she would be willing to do more, but just because the structural system and the parliamentary system is as it is, there wouldn't be a majority, and then the industry would be slow, and so on. So she uses that as her arguments. But let's be honest, when we had the outbreak of the pandemic, the government was very quick to react. They said this is a crisis, and they pulled themselves together, and they did a lot of things which never seemed possible before. And it is in that sense true that the climate has never been treated as a crisis like that, but I think that's also because it is rooted in the economic system that we are having, and if we wanted to make any adjustments to the climate crisis, we would need to go very, very deep and actually change much deeper level of the economic system. And that, of course, is not easily done. It is not easily done with party politics, and particularly, of course, not with the Conservative Party.
But she is the one 10 years ago who made the decision to exit nuclear power in your country. That was a good decision? No? I don't know.
I think it's a much debated decision, and I think...
I ask because we have the same debate in Belgium right now, and it's difficult. Huh?
So, of course, what happened when Germany decided to get out of to get off the nuclear power, it meant that we continued to use coal quite a lot, which, of course, faces huge carbon emissions. So
it's more polluting.
The real debate is really how would we get to a socio-economic system where we're using less energy, because we cannot continue to use this amount of energy and to grow the amount of energy, to expand the amount of energy every year and every year and every year. So we actually have to find a way to reduce the demand and find ways which are more targeted at the well-being of people, making sure that everyone in the society has enough, but not really growing the demand every time. So this, of course, is a completely different debate, and a very, very hard debate to have, because whenever you're telling people that we really fundamentally have to change how our society is operating, that we should live with less, I think a lot of people, understandably, also become scared and worried. Because it's hard to imagine such a future, because at this moment we are very much pitched one against the other, meaning that I only can have more if someone else has less. So generally we have to find ways in the society how we're getting better at sharing and living together and taking care of each other, both at the local but also at the global scale.
In general, do you trust in politicians? Do you speak with the politician leaders? Have you, for example, ever met Angela Merkel? I don't know.
No, I have personally not met her. After my arrest, we got some contact requests from politicians, but I actually passed them on to the organization as well, because personally, I don't think that it's good for any organization or any sort of movement to have one person pushed into the center. So I have not met any of the high-ranked politicians, I would say, in Germany, apart from maybe in passing, but never in an official appointment.
Okay.
And I think there are definitely some politicians who get into politics with the best interest, you know? And of course, they have a wide range of ideas what the best thing is for the society. But I think in the system, it's hard to stay true to your values, because of course you have to compromise very often. And
can you get into politics yourself? Have you ever been asked for that?
It's often journalists who ask that question. Or
it's interesting to know.
And my reply is always the same. As activists, as a person who's engaged in social movement, I'm already part of the politics.
Okay.
Because there's a lot of political engagement outside of the party politics. And that's the way that I will continue to be involved.
Do you vote? Will you vote this weekend? I'm not going to ask for who, but do you vote?
Yeah, I do vote. I have already voted, because a lot of people now use the letter, the mail ballot, basically, because it's safer because of COVID. And I think it is important to use that opportunity. But it's more important what we are doing in between the 4 years,
of course,
between the period that we are going for the federal elections, because there are so many more important things to do than these 5 minutes of voting. But I do think it's important because it's also a privilege to be able to vote.
You told me that a lot of people in Germany couldn't vote.
Yeah, I was actually quite shocked to hear the numbers. So I'm not only talking about children now, I'm talking about people who are older than 18 years, adults, who cannot vote because they don't have a German passport. But they are people who may have been living in Germany for a decade, who are working, who are paying tax, who are what we would call well integrated, but they don't have a passport for many reasons. For example, some reason could be that if you take a German passport, you have to give up your other nationality that you had before. And maybe for some reason of your family life or personal circumstances, you cannot do that. You're not ready to do it. We have now about 14% of the adult population in Germany that cannot go and vote on this Sunday. And this is a massive amount of people. And it's a shame that these people cannot use this democratic right. And I think that when I, as a person who has the possibility to use voting rights, I will definitely vote for a party that is aiming to include these people and that is aiming to lower the barriers of engagement for voting, for sure.
And we have the same debate here in Belgium. Maybe you can explain what you did this morning, if you're okay with that, who we met.
Yeah, sure. This morning I had the great opportunity to be in Brussels and meet some of the sans-papiers people who are in the church, in the Béguinage church in Brussels, and which had been on the hunger strike for, as you know, several months. And they have been promised by the Belgian government that they would receive replies on their applications for regularization. And they have been told it would take a maximum of 2 weeks, but it's now been 1 month, so 4 weeks, and they still haven't had any replies. And they were very, very frustrated because they are people who have been working, who have children, who are going to the school, who have lived for a decade or more, part of them, here in Belgium, and they have absolutely no way forward. They're completely dependent on the authorities, but there is nothing that they can do anymore to actually improve their situation. And it really begs the question, like, why can I, with my passport, travel to so many countries and just visit there? Or why is it so easy for a person like me to get a work permit in some other country, but it's so impossible for the people who can prove that they have been part of the Belgian society already, that they're anchored here to get the regularization. And that is just a scandal. It's really a scandal. Of course, it's not only a problem of Belgium. It happens in all the countries across Europe. But these are the people like which need our solidarity right in front of our doorstep. We don't even have to look to the external border, where we're often looking when we're talking about refugees and migrants. Right in our doorstep are the people who need our solidarity and who need our engagement.
The theme of the conference tonight is "It's time to act," and it's also the title of your book, Carola. What does it mean? It's time to do what? And why now? Why it's time now?
Well, the book has a huge focus on the ecological crises. And what the climate scientists, but also the biodiversity scientists are saying, of course, is that we are getting very close to reaching critical tipping points in the climate system. So, of course, ecological problems have existed for decades, and social problems, which are the cause of that, have, of course, existed for centuries. So, the urgency really lies in the fact of the tipping points that we could reach if we do not drastically reduce the emissions.
It's not too late to act? It's never too late?
It's, in a way, it doesn't matter how bad the situation is, there's always a point in acting. But every day that we have now is better than tomorrow. Like today will always be so much better than tomorrow, because in terms of the natural climate system, time is of the essence. We will not be able to turn back the clock on what is already lost, particularly also on the biodiversity of species. If we are losing species, we don't know how to bring them back. And often we don't know exactly what the species are doing in the ecosystem, what function they are having. And we are facing potentially very, very severe problems, ecological problems as well, due to the rapid loss of species caused mainly by industries of the global north. Loss of habitats, overfishing, climate change, pollution, invasive species, they're all caused by countries and companies in the global north. So that's where we have to solve the issue. So the critical issue is really to change our imperial way of living here in the global north. It's to restrict the companies. If we don't do that, and if we don't do it now, we actually don't know how safe our future, the human future, but also the future of all the other living beings, will be. We're facing a very, very severe risk for all of us.
And for you, everyone has got to play a part to take in this? Young people, old people, poor people, rich people, from north to south, from east to west?
Well, we're looking at a social transformation of a quite global scale. But I would like to point out that there are many societies, particularly indigenous communities, that do not overexploit the ecosystems that they're living in. So we're looking mainly at Western cultures, which critically have to change how we are living and how we're exploiting all the world around us. And that there are different ways of living together is something that can inspire us and what we can learn from other people. So there is a way forward if we would be able to decenter ourselves and leave this Eurocentric or Western perspective.
But how to convince those who don't believe anymore, those who don't trust in the human capacity to change, because many people seem resigned, don't you think?
I think there are various answers to that. On one hand, I always like to remind people how much more difficult it is to organize or to do something when you're, for example, living in the global south. If you're faced already with many more problems in your life than the average person here in this room. And I'm not saying that no one here is facing problems, but on average, we have more possibilities than, for example, maybe a person in Bangladesh has to do with something. So that, of course, is one reason why we shouldn't resignate, because there are still so many things that we can do. And the other thing, I think, is that we have to overcome this cultural narrative of people being self-centered and always looking out for their own interest. Because we actually know that humans as a species wouldn't have survived or wouldn't have evolved if we were not actually a species that depends on mutual aid and on supporting each other, because humans only exist and thrive in groups. If humans were like individual people, they would have not come to this point, you know? So we have a very, very deep-rooted sense of cooperation. And we have to bring that back into the forefront of our thinking, because in this typically very capitalist way of thinking that we have been taught by the society, we focus on observing that people are looking out for themselves, when really, if we change our focus, we always can see how much people actually look out for each other, and how much people are actually at their best when they're cooperating. And that, I think, is a story we have to keep telling, and that we have to keep reminding people, because they actually know it.
And what was your trigger? When did you realize that you wanted to act, to become an activist? There was, I don't know, a special meeting or a special event in your personal life or during your studies or your childhood? I don't know.
For me, it was certainly like a series of events, and I guess that is the case for a lot of people. So each of these single events makes you a little bit more aware, and you learn from different events. And I think one of the most important things for me personally was 10 years ago, when I had just graduated from university and I just got my navigation license, and we went to the North Pole on a research icebreaker with a lot of scientists, and I had like these ideas what the North Pole is like, and there would be lots of ice and it would be really hard to get there. And then we arrived with the ship, and it was actually very easy because there wasn't a lot of old and very thick ice. The ice was actually already very thin 10 years ago. And we had some scientists, some oceanographers, sea ice physicists on board, and some of them were like 50 or 60 years old, so they were like really experienced scientists, and they were very frustrated. And they were talking to each other, and they were saying, we have been reporting this for 20 or 30 years, and nothing has happened with our reports. We've been warning about this, and all these reports have been just thrown in the wind. And when I observed these discussions, that was very certainly a point when I realized that what we are lacking is not so much the scientific facts, but really the political action. And it made me think a lot about how do we create that political will to do something.
And so maybe we can talk a little bit about the IPCC report, so le rapport du GIEC. Climate change is widespread, rapid and intensifying. So that is what IPCC said in last August. These conclusions of the experts are not really new. That's absolutely what you just said. Scientists have been warning us for years and years. How do you explain that we don't listen to this expert, I mean, earlier?
I think one of the core issues with the IPCC reports has been that, particularly in the beginning, they didn't include any social sciences. So the natural sciences have been really siloed from the social sciences. a lot of people now, including the activists, have become quite good, I think, at explaining the natural science facts of climate change, but they are partly less good explaining the social sciences, understanding the social sciences, which are how do we actually create that transformation of the society that we need? What is the psychology? What are the psychological barriers of people to act? Why do we have that knowledge action gap? Like, how do we help people who are actually interested to do something and who care? How do we give them the tools? What do they need to actually start and do something? And these are answers, or these are questions which the social sciences actually have answers to, and which we can study, and where science also can help us, but also practical experience of activists who are engaged in social movements for decades can help us. And I think that is what has been critically missing from the debate, particularly in the, let's say, first decades of climate science.
And so the IPCC report, it was in August, but in July you spoke about it. There were impressive and huge floodings here in Belgium, also in Germany. How did you react when you see that in your country?
Well, it's devastating, of course, to see or to hear how many lives have been lost. And to see the loss and the tragedy in this. It has shown me, for example, how badly prepared the disaster services are, even in a country like Germany. And I think it has made clear to a lot of people that the climate crisis, the intensifying of these climate catastrophes.
For you, these events are the consequences of the climate crisis?
It's also what science tells us, that we are more likely to have more severe flooding or drought or hurricanes and so on. We know that it will get more and it will get worse. But I think
there is also the heat dome in the north of the United States.
Which is people do get used to things. So same as we have seen with COVID, we have seen that people first got really shocked that people are dying of this disease, preventable, if we would act as a society. But then they got used to it. And I think there is the same risk with climate disasters. We might just get used to them. And I think this is very important. If we are already engaged on these issues, we really have to try to find ways to engage the people who start to care, for example, as a result of a natural disaster. We have to try to engage them and show them what they can do practically, groups that they can join, initiatives that they can join. Because if we don't show them an opportunity to engage, I think they will just get frustrated. And of course, over time,
you think
they will also
just
get used to it.
don't have the opportunity, but they want to do something?
I think a lot of people are ready to do something.
But
at least when we're looking at polls, we see that people really care, for example, about climate. We even saw, for example, now with Afghanistan, we saw in Germany, for example, that a lot of people actually wanted to evacuate the Afghanis who had helped the German forces, for example. There was a large majority of people who are saying we have to do that. And I think the key issue is more that people have overall been quite apolitical, not so well organized. Membership of unions is going down, for example. Social movements haven't been particularly strong in the last decades. Social engagement generally hasn't been so big in politics. And I think that is what we have to revive. We have to somehow find ways to engage people who care, but who are not actively engaged. People who are kind of in a passive or neutral position. But I think the fact that people are not doing something doesn't necessarily mean that they don't care. They, I think, often don't know what to do.
They don't know how to do.
Yeah, and they need a help, and they need the tools, basically, to get started.
On the 1st of November, the COP26 takes place in Glasgow, in Scotland. Do you believe in this kind of summit, if this kind of moment? Because we remember, for example, the last COP, the 25th, it was difficult. It was really long and it was difficult. Do you believe in this?
It's a difficult question, which has various perspectives, I think. On one hand, of course, I don't think there will be a huge result because the other 25 COPs haven't brought a huge result. Or what they have brought are promises, but not concrete actions. The greenhouse gas emissions are still rising, and the other 25 COPs have done nothing for that. Another problem, of course, this time is that a lot of people from the global south are actually not able to travel there. Because despite the UK government promising that they would help to vaccinate the delegates, they have actually not done that. And a lot of people haven't even gotten their first vaccination shot. So they're probably not going to be able to attend Glasgow. And this will lead to another a very skewed power dynamic and who is even able to attend the COP. But I think more critically from our own perspective, we have to do something practically. And it is more logical and I think more practical if as activists we push our national governments on concrete places where we are, where the transition is visible and possible, and that we confront them and build political power to push them in more local confrontations and in more local contexts. Because what we are seeing from the international agreements is often just a lot of hot air.
Okay. So let's talk about another COP, maybe the 24th. I think it was in Poland, in Katowice, and we met there another young lady, Greta Thunberg. Can I ask you, what do you think about her?
Well, I have not met Greta in person, so I've obviously been quite inspired by the amount of young people who turned out in the streets and the enthusiasm that they have. Speaking of political strategy for the movements, we have to see that also because of COVID, now less and less people are turning out for the strikes. And that the strikes, even in Germany, have become a bit symbolic because they're not putting pressure on the government to act. Because, well, the strikers are coming out every Friday for 1 or 2 hours and then they go home. And they don't put pressure on the government. It's not like they would come out and occupy the office of Angela Merkel and stay there until she does something. So we have to choose tactics as a movement which put pressure on, for example, the Chancellor or who else could potentially do something. And we have to choose these tactics wisely. And at this moment, young people are maybe too focused on just one tactic. While, of course, on the other hand, we do have direct occupations, we do have other actors in the climate justice space which are using more confrontational tactics, but we also need the numbers.
Okay.
If we want to put pressure, we need the numbers. We really need people to engage in a way that it can matter. So, for example, speaking of the German context now, we would need Fridays for Future to say, we are all going to the occupation at the village and we're staying here and we're putting our tents here and we're, instead of doing a climate strike every Friday, the next 52 Fridays, no, we are just staying here 52 days next to the coal pit and preventing the digging up of the coal.
Maybe we can invite Greta in your ZAD? No?
Yeah, for sure we can invite her and offer, of course, we would offer her a space in a tent or a treehouse or whatever she likes, but of course also any other less famous person is welcome in the ZAD because it's also a nice place to to exchange and to learn and to meet a lot of people.
I was joking, but in Belgium we have Adélaïde Charlier, Hanouna de Wever. In Germany you have Louisa Neubauer. In France it's Camille Etienne. So it's always young ladies. How do you explain that? Is ecology a female matter?
Well,
where are the boys? The men?
Well, I think on one sense, we have, of course, a huge movement on ecofeminism, but I do think Fridays for Future are not so much linked to that, let's say. I see a slightly different dynamic, which is, of course, that women have been gaining slightly more and more power and representation in Western European spaces and societies. And that, on one hand, the media is also getting maybe a bit tired of always presenting the same faces and people and kind of looking for someone else to show. But at the same time, I think a lot of people are critically missing from the picture, because all these women are white women, are middle-class women, same as myself.
Okay.
And they are now in the center of these struggles. I'm not seeing in the European space any person of color at the center stage in the meetings with Angela Merkel or Macron, or any person with a different ability, or a person from the working class, rooted in the working class really, a sans-papier person, or someone like that, engaged in this climate movement and at the center, being able to become the center figure of it.
And why?
That just means
Why
there's a lot of work to do. Like, it has various reasons of the movement itself, from the movement itself, but also, of course, the society as a whole. So I'm really happy that it's easier for women to come to the center stage and to get the media attention, but we have to be aware of that, and we have to create the spaces and the platform for other people to actually speak and lead.
Do you think that if you were a man, your story would have been different? I mean, your activism story, or if the captain of the Sea-Watch 3 was a man, the story would have been different in Italy, in Lampedusa, with Matteo Salvini? I don't know. I just ask.
Yeah, it definitely would have been different, because in the media attention on the whole situation and the case, and also in the reaction from politicians, sexism was definitely an issue. And it polarized as well, and it gave the whole issue attention. So if we had had a male captain at that point, we probably would have had less attention on the case. And maybe that person who would have been the captain wouldn't have gotten as much attention. That's actually what I'm thinking. And maybe the whole case, the whole situation would not have sparked that intense discussion.
I come back to Greta Thunberg because, like her, you became 2 years ago a kind of icon. Lots of people see you like a hero, the hero of the migrants' cries. I know that you don't like that. Is it why you refused several prizes or awards? And why did you accept to become Doctor Honoris Causa of this university?
Yeah, there are various questions, so I have to think
I know.
which one I will answer first.
I know you don't have a lot of time, so...
Okay, yeah, right. So very generally speaking, it's clear that even though I had the legal responsibility as the captain of the Sea-Watch 3, we have been working in a team with at least 22 people on the ship, a lot of people in the back office, and a lot more people which support the organization or which support the struggle in the wider sense. So whenever people wanted to give me some award, particularly for that situation, we had decided to pass it on to the organization as a whole. When I get requests for speaking, I typically or always pass them on to migrants or refugees to speak for themselves. Unfortunately, about half the time, people then tell me that the interview can't happen or the event won't happen because it's just not as interesting to have an unknown person speaking. So that is another huge issue. But it's also, I think we have to be clear that migration is a topic strongly, how we look at that and what is happening has a very, very strong racist dynamic. And I just think for myself it would be completely wrong to put myself in the center of a movement and overshadow the voices of so many people who should be speaking and who have far more interesting and far more important stories to tell us than that particular moment of the sea rescue. So it's a difficult decision, often, like which
because you want to use your
take for myself.
You want to use your celebrity to share a message.
Yeah, but also to share the platform, for example. So to answer kind of the last question, I only take opportunities or awards which are focused on the connection of social and ecological issues because I'm mainly based in ecological activism. And that's, for example, why I agreed to take the award from the university, because they were looking at the different aspects of the activism that I'm doing.
I spoke about you like an icon. Who do you admire? Do you have any hero in your life?
I think there are a lot of people who have great life stories, and it's hard to pick a single one of them. I think in most social movements that we know, we have seen a lot of like male leadership and a lot of women who have not made it to the center stage, who have put in a lot of work and dedication and whose life stories are very inspiring.
And maybe a last question. What do you think about the media? Do you read the news? Do you listen to the radio? Do you watch to the television? Do you use the social networks?
I do read the news online. I don't even have an apartment where I live in, so I also don't have a television for probably a decade or so. But I try actually to abstain from social media quite a lot because I think it's very polarizing. It's very hard to have any real engagement with people. It's sometimes great to share information. It's great to get something like, oh, someone published a paper or there's a new report. That's a fantastic thing to get out of Twitter, for example. But otherwise, it's very hard to have a conversation and to engage people. And I think the news, of course, are often focused on very negative things that happen, which I think can put us in a negative mood. Whereas if we put that aside and we're focusing on what we can do right now and who we can meet and we engage with the people that we meet in our everyday lives, we are actually a bit happier and we are also more confident about humans in general because we actually mostly every day have a lot of good experiences with the people that we meet. And I think that is an important spirit to keep. So I recommend not to read or to engage too much with the news or to limit it because I think it creates a huge bias on what the world and what our surroundings are actually like.
I have the impression that you never stops. Do you have any free time? I don't know.
I do, of course, have some free time because I see this as a long-term struggle. Like, so many people have engaged before me and I'm not going to change something in the next days, weeks, or years. that other people have not managed to do. And I think it's important to take some time for yourself, for your family, for something that isn't necessarily directly political work, because we all need some sort of balance to stay engaged long term. So I do definitely do that, and I also recommend that other people who engage in activism or politically or any other social issues do that, because that level of self-care is very important to engage in the long run.
And where do you see yourself in, I don't know, 10 years? What do you think?
It's a very good question, but of course I will still be living in the ZAT and the coal pit will be closed. Huh? So I don't know, probably somewhere in a social movement or in an ecological movement. But it's very hard to foresee because I think we're really entering a period of time where we're having more and more crises on social and ecological levels. And it's very hard to foresee what the world will look like in 10 years.
Thank you so much, Carola. I could continue that for a while, but I think it's your turn now. So do you have any question, guys? And of course, you can ask your question in French. Yes, hein, Carola? Vous pouvez poser vos questions en français si c'est plus facile pour vous, mais Carola vous répondra en anglais. Est-ce que je me balade avec un micro? Je ne sais pas ce que tu souhaites que je fasse, ça ne me dérange pas du tout. Ah ok, pardon. D'accord. Oui.
Carola, super many thanks, very inspiring words. You can hear in German, but I was born in Germany as well, so it's good in German, but I want to understand. Carola, I'm actually working for industry, for an industry association. And my industry is in the detergent industry, so it's not the energy industry, automotive industry, so what we are facing is indeed difficulties to motivate people to act in a more sustainable way. And we try to find vehicles to communicate the message. The problem is that industry is the bad devil in the game. And people find industry not credible enough to listen to. And we are trying to also reach out to civil society, to NGOs, try to do things together. But what we sometimes experience is that NGOs slow down. They don't want to talk to us, don't want to listen, because they think, okay, we just want to sell our products. How do you see that? Do you see a way to find some more cooperative approaches, civil society, industry, just to reach the targets together? Because we have the objectives are children. I'm also very much interested that the world turns better, and people working for industry, they have families. So how do you see that?
Yeah, I think that's a big debate, and you're not the first one to mention it, because I've actually recently been in a panel where we're talking about finance, and there were different people who are working in businesses, and they're of course saying, well, I'm also interested in living on this planet in the future, and we're trying to make some transition in our companies. And I truly believe there are people obviously working in the industry who want to be part of that society transformation. And I think building trust between people or between groups always takes a lot of time. So we know that from the activist perspective, maybe more when we're trying to build alliances between different groups. And the groups are really different, but maybe aligned on one single campaign or one thing that they want to do together. But it always takes a lot of time. It takes like the personal relations. It takes a lot of meetings, usually a lot of exchange for people to start to trust each other and see what they can do together despite all the differences on other issues that they may have. And I think this building of alliances is really critical for what we're doing, but it's also, I think, one of the hardest tasks that we have to do in our societies. And I think for sure that from an activist perspective, it is of course much easier if I was saying everyone who's working in the industry is just a terrible person, you know? And I think with a lot of disappointments that people have had or stories about greenwashing, there is just a lot of distrust, and a lot of distrust that is probably well-founded. And I think that is obviously why it's so difficult to build trust. And that's why it's time-consuming. And it's also, I think, a valid criticism to activists to be aware that we need to include everyone in the transformation, you know? And that we cannot only escalate the action by becoming more radical ourselves, but also by including people from all different groups and giving them the possibility to engage and work together despite the differences that exist.
Allez-y, je vous en prie.
Ministre d'État de l'immigration en France, dit qu'il ne peut pas régler la situation d'un sans-papier s'il ne se régularise pas, s'il ne se met pas dans une situation, il ne pourra pas bénéficier du droit de l'État français. Le pape François, dans sa dernière encyclique, Tutti Fratelli, dit juste le contraire. On ne doit pas tenir compte du droit, on doit être généreux. Comment pourrions-nous accepter toute la misère du monde d'après vous?
Yeah. From my perspective, law is, of course, very changeable. I mean, we have seen through the course of time that laws have always changed. And often the laws are behind the actual state of mind of the society at that point. I mean, very easy to see when we're looking at things like gay marriage or so. It's first that the society is already convinced that we should do that, and then it takes still another like 2 decades until we finally have a law to allow that. And I think we should look at the law as something flexible and changeable that is dictated by the society and not the other way around. So if we are convinced enough that these people, which now have no papers, should have papers, as a society, we can push for the change, and it will be possible to change those laws. And we could theoretically come to a point in time where everyone will think that it's completely ridiculous that these people didn't have papers just because of the way that they arrived here, or the way, the country that they came from, or so on. So I think this is the mindset which we need to have. Of course, it's very difficult to get enough political power, to get enough pressure to change the law, but the law has been changed so many times, and it's our big task, not an easy task at all, but it's our big task to make it possible so that the sans-papiers don't exist anymore, because they will all have papers, or, as they will say, nobody will have papers, because this idea of papers will not exist anymore.
It seems simple when we heard you. It's okay for you? Yes? Maybe another question? No? Yes? Mr. with the hat.
Yeah, I have a question. About how I think often as activists you're moved by things you see in your environment, and as you do, even within the ecological crisis, you see these very concrete cases that you want to do something about, like the Zata division. And I was just wondering how do that compare
Yeah, I think the question about the local and the global is often debated. I mean, and most people obviously only can find their personal view of it. I can really understand that we try to have a general awareness of what is going on globally, but then of course the place where we can make a change practically is really often just at our doorstep in the local project. And of course, I think we all know this sentence like, think global, act local, because, I mean, mostly we don't have another possibility than acting locally. But at the same time, I think it's important to build solidarity with people elsewhere and to try to help someone who is in another place practically. I do think this networking and solidarity projects are very important because this connection of struggle makes us stronger as a whole movement, but also helps to educate ourselves to learn from people who are engaged elsewhere. But I do also agree that it really feels like there is a strong lack of a larger political vision globally how we could really turn things around. I kind of hear a sentiment that I know from myself, which is that we're, as a progressive movement or so, let's say we are lacking a clear vision of the future. A really detailed and possible version of how things could be different. And when I see what's going on in the news, as we said, I don't read so much the news, in Europe, that alternative is really not so visible. I think for me personally, it's often more visible in struggles, for example, in Latin America and South America, where really justice is more at the core of the struggles that are being fought. When we are looking at Chile, for example, which 2 years ago had this huge uprising and now is able to rewrite its constitution with gender parity, the same amount of women and men writing in the constitution, and for the first time indigenous people being part of writing the constitution. That's a massive shift. And we have seen, I think, in the last years, these larger scale movements, mainly in South America, and not so much here in Europe, like movements which have really managed to shift power and change something, are very rare here in Europe. So I think it's easier to get inspiration from somewhere else at this moment.
Monsieur en orange, vous aviez...
Don't you think, you use the word education, don't you think that taking care of the planet where we live should be introduced in education, starting with family and then according to the education system?
Well, we would hope it is, and I totally agree. Yeah, it should be taking care of the community, and the community of life encompassing all living beings should be part of what we are teaching children in each society and what is at the core of our human identity. But of course, in the formal education that we're having, we're more focused on exploiting resources and how to do that, and less on the part of caretaking or regenerating, or on the part of having a responsibility towards other living beings by the pure fact that we are living and that we are having these possibilities. So for sure, I think it would be great if we teach, or if we get that perspective of being part of this network of living beings and having a responsibility to take care of all the other living beings, including the human ones. But I would think that this ideally would be less part of formal education, but something that we socially teach people already from an early age, and that becomes part of our everyday living and being. Well, the advice for young people, I think the first thing that you mentioned about yourself, you have done already, you're joining a group of people. My first advice is always like, when you start to do something, join a group of people that is already doing something. It's much easier because you can learn from them and you can engage and you will not be alone. But I think another critical thing that we have to do in those groups is to find a strategy. To not just engage in tactics or pick any fight which comes our way, but to be strategic and to learn about social movement strategy and about political power and how other people have confronted it, how movements have confronted it successfully. So I think there's a lot of learning that we all should be doing, that we can do, and that is engaging in learning from past struggles and learning how we can effectively build any sort of counterpower to the current situation that we are facing.
Voilà. Maintenant tout le monde s'y met. Monsieur en bleu devant. Je ne sais pas si c'est du... Oui, pardon, je dis monsieur, mais je me trompe peut-être. Avec les mains, je ne vois pas grand-chose.
Yeah, I think, I don't know what the specific context is that you are engaged in, for example, but I think we often care like very deeply about an issue and we want to bring other people to care about it as well, or to include them in our groups, and we're kind of disappointed because they don't have maybe enough time or they don't show up or so on. I think the only answer that I can come up with really is to try to have honest conversations with people to find out what they care about. Because I think it's often very difficult to push them to do something that you care about, but to kind of find out what are the struggles, what are the issues that people care about in their lives at that moment. And try to give them the tools and support for their struggle. You know, and maybe find possibilities to build bridges between what you care about or what I care about and what these other people care about. How do these issues come together? Where can we build something together? But I think as activists, and as a sort of self-criticism here, we are often so convinced of our own topic that it's hard for us to put ourselves in the shoes of someone else who is maybe facing some completely different sort of struggles. And I think this goes more into the debate about like community organizing and understanding what is happening to a completely different set of people and what matters to them. You know, like meeting people where they are, at what matters to them now, and helping them with that struggle, instead of trying to draw them necessarily into your struggle if that's not where they are. But that is unfortunately the best answer which I have to that really difficult question.
Okay. And vous juste devant, oui. Bridges. Where do you find your energy? Maybe that can be the question.
Yeah, so the first question was kind of that you're, well, trying to engage and sensitize people on the issue of migration in particular, and it's often the same people that show up. I think for people that is engaged is probably a common problem. And I think one of the issues sometimes is the spaces and places where we're meeting other people. That we generally in society we're lacking spaces where we're meeting people from other groups, or as we often now say, bubbles. And it's hard to meet people who are not already engaged. And I think it's an important part of activism somehow to be able to create really low entrance meeting spaces, which maybe even have less openly political focus, but create the possibility for people from different communities to come together and to meet in the first place, so that we even have the opportunity to meet people from outside these spaces where we are already engaged. So I think if only the same people turn up, it kind of shows that the entrance barriers to the space are, despite our own thinking, maybe still too high, or that it doesn't, the sort of concept doesn't relay well with what other people want of a meeting space. So I think often if we find a possibility to create a meeting space where really different people come together and actually hang out and spend time together, I think then we have a possibility that they will start to care for each other and they will learn about each other, and then they maybe get engaged politically. But I think it's often hard to create these spaces, but a very critical task, in my opinion. Bringing people together, having actual meeting spaces physically for people to spend time together and engage. And the second question on ecology, well, yes, kind of where does the energy come from? I personally get a lot of energy out of the people that I'm working with or that are engaged, even though there's of course also a group dynamic, sometimes that we are all feeling overwhelmed and overpowered by these very, very different power dynamics that we are seeing, and the lack of power that we often feel that we have. But taking a step back and looking at the larger scale pictures, I do think that we can see some wins, some changes, little steps that often seem very small. They're always too small for what we really need, but that we actually can see that our activism does make some change, some improvement to the lives of other people. And I think it's kind of important to have realistic expectations of what one can achieve. And despite all the frustration of what we're not achieving, I think it's also good to use that perspective of kind of self-compassion and look at what you actually have achieved, you know, and not try to measure yourself up to all the forces of the biggest coal company that you can find, which is a power that each of us doesn't have, but to be realistic in our how we measure or compare our own achievement to what is really necessary. I think it's more healthy to kind of measure our achievement against doing nothing or not engaging at all, and also against our kind of willingness and intention instead of the actual achievement, because I think that will always make us feel very frustrated because the power dynamics are so skewed, as you say. Well, I think we can see a general push of many governments to reduce migration, at least of refugees or of migrants, for example, coming from Africa or Bangladesh and so on, from certain specific countries, not migration in general. And criminalizing helpers does help them supposedly to achieve that goal. But at the same time, I think it's important to keep in mind that the criminalization of the people themselves is always a lot worse at the same time. And that mostly people who are, for example, connected to NGOs and that get criminalized, maybe in Belgium there were cases for housing people or for helping someone over the border in the Alps or so from Italy to France or whatever in the sea. These people mainly have connections and possibilities to get attention, to get the funding for their lawyers and so on. So their situation isn't actually as bad. But when we're looking at Greece, for example, where people who are fleeing from Turkey to Greece typically are charged for smuggling, not only generally for the whole boat, but normally out of each refugee boat, one person who was supposedly steering the boat is then declared the smuggler, and these people get charged with smuggling for each of the other persons that was on the boat. So for example, if there were 10 people apart from you on the boat, you get charged 15 years for each person. And a lot of people have been prosecuted and been put into jail for more than 100 years, supposedly. And that is just something which doesn't happen to a white person in Europe. Yes, people have harsh consequences of criminalization, maybe court processes and so on, but really the worst and most severe issues of criminalization are faced by the refugees themselves. And mostly there's absolutely no media attention on the cases because there are uncountable amounts nearly of these cases, and people disappear into these jails for decades without anyone actually paying attention to it. Yeah, of course, it costs the state a lot of money, as you're saying, to have the trial, to put the people into jail. But I think on the general context of European policies, apparently it does make sense to quite a lot of parties to put up these very high border walls and to prevent any people from entering the countries that are, by their definition, unwanted. And we see that also in the spending, huge spending increases on the European border police, for example, the way that they are getting militarized, that there are more drones, more fences, more planes for surveillance, and that the budget is supposed to increase ever and ever more, despite the fact that the border agency is carrying out or involved in human rights abuses, for example, or neglect of their duty to actually check on the asylum processes of each person, you know, instead of just returning them and refueling them to the country they come from. So I think we have to see this in a very long-term context of the colonial European history, which has always exploited and murdered people in the past. I don't necessarily see it as a new phenomenon. I see it in this very long-term context where the exploitation, particularly of black people and people of color, has been constant and has been ongoing and is now more visible at our external borders, but I think has been there all the time. So even though it kind of feels like it's a new thing because it's now more visible at the border, I do think it really has been there all the time and is actually not so new.
Okay, so time flies. So maybe a very, very last question. Okay, you're the one. Yes, everyone is agree. Okay, you're the one.
Votre attitude en tant que capitaine a été l'objet de l'admiration dans le monde entier. Vous avez été là très humaine. Vous avez fait preuve d'humanité. Quel conseil donneriez-vous pour qu'on apprenne à chacun à devenir plus humain?
It's another very big question on humanity or what is? Okay, I will need to think about it, and then the conference will never end.
Maybe we can say that you already said it. We have to build more and more bridges every day with everyone. I don't know. I try to help.
I think this is in the way the answer to that. I mean, if we have the possibility to meet other people and truly engage with them and see them as people equal and similar and as human as us, from that moment onwards, it becomes impossible to act in a different way. But in order to be able to get there, the places where we can actually meet each other need to be created. And they need to be created by the people who already care.
So thank you so much, Carola, and thank you, everyone, and thanks to the university. And yeah, we can applaud her.
Thank you very much once again for your coming in Namur and for this discussion with us. The conference has been recorded, and it will be available on the channel of the UNAMUR tomorrow of this week, and it will be translated in few weeks. It will be later. Tomorrow, I hope. I have to negotiate it with my colleagues. Okay, I will continue in French, if it's okay for you. Merci à tout le monde d'avoir été présent. C'est la première d'une longue série de 6. Avant toute chose, donc le 26 octobre, nous aurons Barbara Stiegler qui sera dans nos murs. Donc c'est une philosophe française. On parlera santé et démocratie, aussi un sujet je pense, qui anime les débats, aussi bien sur les réseaux sociaux, dans les familles et avec les collègues. Donc, je vous invite vivement à venir l'écouter. Alors, je vous invite également à venir partager un verre en mode Covid, bien évidemment. Donc, vous pouvez, avant toute chose, avant d'aller nous rejoindre au quai 22, Anouk Delcourt est présente avec nous de la librairie Point Virgule. C'est possible, si vous ne l'avez pas encore, d'acheter le livre de Carola Rackete. Ensuite, nous vous donnons rendez-vous au quai 22, masqué, et vous pourrez consommer une boisson avec nous en mode démasqué mais assis. Voilà, on suit les règles des gestes barrières pour rester en sécurité pour tout un chacun. Voilà, je vous souhaite une excellente soirée. Le quai 22, ça se situe, j'ai oublié de le préciser, on a perdu un peu les habitudes en 1 an et demi. C'est à la rue du Séminaire, c'est l'espace culturel de l'université de Namur. J'espère que tout le monde voit où ça se situe. Thank you very much, Anne-Sophie. Carola. Et je vous vois bientôt, évidemment, le 26 octobre. Vous avez le visage de nos 5 autres conférenciers ici sous les yeux, mais vous pouvez tout retrouver, bien évidemment, sur le site de l'UNAMUR. Bonne soirée et à tout de suite.